Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Guru. Om Guru. Welcome, everybody, to this fifth and final class in our series on communities. And today, as I promised, I'm going to bring up on my screen, I'm going to bring up a number of questions that have been submitted to me. And what I encourage you to do, if something comes up and it's interesting for you to ask, put your question in the chat box, and I have probably a dozen questions or so that have already accumulated. But if I can be quick enough, I'll try to get through these, and then any new ones come in, we'll answer those toward the end. But I was interested in thinking about this, and I was meditating before the class came on, and I went to the dictionary and looked up the word community, what it was, and I'd like to share a little bit of what is a community. And so in classical sense, the definition in the dictionary was a social, religious, occupational, or other group sharing common characteristics or interests, and perceived or perceiving itself as distinct in some respect from the larger society within which it exists. An example they give, of course, is something like the community of scholars, or you could have ethnic communities and so forth, many different groups. And another definition was a social group of any size whose members reside in a specific locality and often have a common cultural and historical heritage. Now, of course, as I mentioned in an earlier one, I grew up in an ethnic community in the United States. My parents had come from Finland, and Finn was spoken in my household, and not all, but many of the neighborhood people were of that descent. And so it was, in a sense, it was a community. And this word community I also noticed it's derived from the word commune. And we think of commune, we use that word, you think of a group of people, of course, living in a shared environment, but it really means to commune. This historically meant it's to share, to associate, or with one another, to have something in common. And I think it stimulated in me this thought that from a spiritual perspective, the idea of community, to commune with other people is to expand our sympathies to include other people in our shared existence together as humans, as devotees, as aspirants, as souls. And I think my understanding of the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda, I've come to feel that this is you might say the way to God realization that is very appropriate for this age. Now, of course, there will always be those who go off, stay in a cave, meditating very deeply, or, and the renunciate, extreme renunciation, such as that outwardly expressed. But I think for the general public, spiritual, and especially for devotees, spiritual advancement, spiritual progress in this age is following that advice that is given by Sri Yukteswar, the overcoming of the meannesses of the heart, to expand our love, to expand our sympathies, to embrace others. And as Master called it, he said it's the social way to God. In other words, through our inner realization, we begin to feel God's presence within ourselves. And of course, we have techniques, and he brought techniques for that purpose. But from that, to expand that sympathies out from our own little selves to our friends and family, our local people, in our environment, and ultimately out beyond to more and more and more, and until ultimately we embrace. In that expansive expansion, we embrace all. And I think this is the lesson society itself is learning and will learn. We obviously haven't learned it yet, but I think it's the lesson that more and more people will learn. And I think that prayer of Paramhansa Yogananda's is very apropos. He says, Lord, I want thee so that I may share thee with all. And I think that's, in a sense, what each of us, to embrace, you might say, to embody, embrace, and try to live according to that ideal. I want thee, Lord, I want thee, but I want thee so that I can share thee with everybody, because joy is infectious, and we feel that joy within ourselves. We want to share it with the larger community. Now, to the questions. First question and there's no particular order to these. It just might say as the order they came in. One question on the spiritual director role, you mentioned one of is to take care of the spiritual welfare of the persons in the community. How does that apply in places like India, where we don't yet have established Ananda communities, like in our village or in Palo Alto? And in other words, he's asking, well, you don't have a spiritual director, and perhaps we don't have a community. How does that apply? We're amorphous, you could say. We don't have a consolidated, defined community. Well, in a sense, we're all of us part right now. Aren't we part of a community? We're part of this online community. We're in that sense, we are part of a community. We're part of a community in spirit. We perhaps don't have a physical expression of that. And in a sense, I think this Ananda community is not something that's limited to physical locale. So one can feel a part of that and can take guidance from those people that are in leadership positions. But I think also that to some degree, the idea of spiritual leadership was a very important principle, and Swami did advise every community to have at least one person to embody that focus, to make it a primary concern within a community to be a spiritual leader. That be the focus of their importance, to be able to watch out for the welfare of individuals. But if we don't have a community like that, I think all of us, it wasn't meant that spiritual leader is somehow different from all of us. I think all of us need to at least take that aspect within ourselves, because if we take community in this broader sense of a group of people, there needs to be, I think, for the welfare of any group, there needs to be some people in there who think of the larger welfare of everybody, that what is holding that community together, what are the ideals? It's not just an accidental community. And I think where we differ from that, when I speak of community, where we differ from that definition, that is somewhat of a community that arose, you might say, accidentally or just inadvertently, whereas we're speaking about an intentional community. And I keep coming back to that word intention. We have to intentionally create community, and within that, it does take, which some of the questions that are going to come up later, the importance of leadership in that community of people. Some people, either as an individual or a group of people that have dedicated themselves to actually intentionally helping to create a community, you could say all share something of a responsibility for taking leadership and embodying those principles and exemplifying them to the degree that they can. And so it to look out for the welfare of the individual is not limited to one person. It's something that principle needs to reside in each one of us. It's the person that is important, that individual that's standing in front of us. We have to look out for that. People are more important than things. And I think that principle is embodied in that phrase, looking out for that. But yet, when you do have a community, it does require some leadership. A question that's asked, somebody asked about, is it necessary to have leadership for a community to form? Theoretically, you could say no. It doesn't need that leadership. A group of people can come, like a committee, you might say, can come. Where, yes, that happens. But if you look at any committee of people, group of people, there's going to be somebody that's going to be a little bit more active in putting ideas into action. And that really is what, many people can have the ideal, support the ideal, but to be able to take that ideal and put it into action usually comes down to a few people. It doesn't have to be just one, but it does come down to a few people. And so you do have to have leadership. Do you need to have a leader, in other words, one, to start a community? Well, usually most things do start with one. So in our case, in Ananda, our community would not have started without Swami Kriyananda being that a leader. But is it sustainable? Swami Kriyananda has passed on. Is it sustainable to have a community that relies upon that one personality, that one person? Well, obviously, probably not, because that leader, when it dissolves, and Swami even used to say that, he says most movements like this, like Ananda, usually die out after the passing of the leader, of that initial leader who started it. And Swami was very cognizant of that fact. And so he put a lot of energy into saying, in order to avoid that, you have to develop a cadre of people who can assume leadership after that. And so we have done that. Ananda's done that. And I think any group, if it hopes to survive, needs to be thinking about that, to be able to develop the qualities of leadership within. Not one person is fine, but in a group of people, because you can't put all of your eggs in one basket of one person. What happens when that person goes? So you have to have the culture of leadership within, I think, for long term. Now, getting something started may be premature to be thinking about this right at the beginning. But as a community is established, you begin to realize that people. Lives are limited. We have to pass that tradition on. I've always been very interested in history, and I've taken a number of seclusions at Catholic monasteries at different places. And they always have a library usually for, if there's, they have guests coming, and some have better libraries than others. And so I began to read a little bit about church history, and I became fascinated by the history of the various monastic orders. And having stayed in Cistercian monasteries, it was fun reading that. And how do they maintain? Because they've been, religious communities have been existed for centuries, way back into the first millennia after Christ. And they've sustained themselves. And it's an interesting tradition, but they almost always have a leader, a spiritual leader, the abbess, the mother abbess, lady abbess. And they have and of course they have different ways of choosing that. I used to always think, well, the Pope appoints the abbot, but that's usually not the case. They're usually the group appoints and finds different mechanisms. They're all not the same, but they usually have some mechanism by which the abbot passes on. A new abbot takes their place by the consent, often, of the members of that particular religious monastery or order. And they have different means, but they have embodied that. And once that abbot is chosen, sometimes it's for life, sometimes there's periods of time, they pledge their loyalty. And that's how they usually come up to whom in that group spiritually is qualified, to whom they can pledge their loyalty. And they pledge their loyalty to that. And I think in a spiritual community, that seems to be, that's a very appropriate model by which to pass on. Somehow you have to have a mechanism for transition of leadership from one generation to the next, but it can vary. I don't think there's one answer to that. And another question here. As a Kriyaban, or one on the path of Kriya Yoga, how spiritual directors here help guide or support the individual in each center here. As a Kriyaban, or one in the path of Kriya Yoga, how do spiritual directors help, guide, or support the individuals in each center? Well, I think that's, in a sense, the primary goal is spiritual, of course, is the spiritual unfoldment and develop. And for example, I don't necessarily think that it's only the duty of a spiritual director to do that. I mean, for myself, I'm a longtime member here in Ananda Village, been also at other Ananda works around the world. And I think it's my duty simply as an elder, whether I'm a spiritual director or not, and I have served as spiritual director in India and elsewhere. But whether that's true or not in that position, I think it is my duty as an elder as somebody who has gained some experience to help other people, to look out for their welfare. And I think this is all of our duty, especially if the people have a little bit of experience. And so I don't think that is limited to just a spiritual director. But of course, if that is one's role, then one has to take that role intentionally and be able to to actuate that and to give advice, to help people, to be able to, sometimes tricky decisions come up and to help guide that, but not to impose. You don't impose anything, but you can offer help. And if people accept it, that's fine. If they don't, well, often the case. Actually, people come to ask me for advice, and I would always say first, I'd say, do you want advice or do you want support? And I've found that most people don't really want advice. What they want is support. And unfortunately, sometimes it's support for their own already ideas that they have what they ought to do already. But you have to support them spiritually, and then maybe once in a while give a little bit of advice. And okay, third question, the ideal number of people in a community, what might that be? I don't think there's an ideal number. And I think you have to, because whatever that number is in a community, different sizes have different qualities. I've lived in Ananda communities most of my life. And at the beginning, they were small, and there's a certain charm to a small community. Everybody knows everybody, and things tend to work on a consensus basis. Because one person, if you're one amongst 20 people, well, you have a big impact. So the need for consensus on everything tends to be more, and you can communicate with everybody, and people can come to consensus on many different things. How should we do this? And it's more family-like. And of course, that family grows, and then pretty soon you have 50 people. Well, that's kind of nice too, because, families can be a little bit confining after a while. You want to have a little bit of variety. And that begins to, and there's more, as a larger group of people can do more different things. As a community begins to grow, there's more opportunities to express in different ways. And it has a different quality. And it can keep on growing. Now, I do think there's probably it comes to a limit of when you can really know everybody and be familiar with everybody. Right now, I'm at Ananda Village, and it's many hundreds of people, and I really don't know everybody. I kind of recognize the face, but I don't really say I know them. And but yet we're a very successful community. And so it varies, but I do think if I was to I'd say, I read once somebody doing a study of these sorts of things that any one individual has a very difficult time getting to know more than 150 people. And they can hold that and be somewhat relatable to about that many people. Where do you draw the line on these things? I don't know if that's possible, but I think communities, would probably be successful in the 100, somewhere between 100, 150, somewhere in there. But I don't think we need to set, firm limits on all of that, because different communities have different purposes. You see, now Ananda Village has a lot of purposes, a lot of things it can do, and so a larger community seems to be appropriate and works quite well. Swami Kriyananda used to say, we ought to have a community of 1,000 people. Well, I can't imagine. That would be a huge amount of work to be able to coordinate that many people, and you end up having to have a bureaucracy to do that. But yet, I think it would be a nice statement to be able to actually do such a thing successfully as a model, you might say, for society as a whole, because it's larger and it's like, that would be like a little town. I don't know. We'll have to see in the future. And I think I don't think one should necessarily limit one's aspirations, but usually I think most communities, we're talking in the 100, 150 maybe, or smaller. And, that would, I think, be appropriate. The dynamics change as the size changes. You'll see. How much land is needed to create a self-sustainable off-grid community? Well, this is, of course, again, what is one's intentions? And I guess you could even take this to say, why do we want land? Well, physically, we have to all fit, of course. You could sort of say for that reason, it's the various functions of the community. But probably you could have a very nice community with 5 acres of land, and you don't need. But I think when people say a self-sustaining off-grid community, they're thinking of agriculture, they're thinking of those sorts of things. And of course, if you're in a city, how are you possibly going to have, unless 5 acres is huge expense? How can you even find that within a community? So other variations are necessary, I think, and I think most people do, as I pointed out sometime previously, most people do live in urban situations. But I think a couple of our Ananda communities have come up with a nice solution. Is they have urban communities, they own, you might say, apartment complexes, or you could even have one that's in a large building, which are more prevalent in India and some other countries where land is more precious, you might say. But they have decided to buy property, a small piece of property out in the country. You see, they have the communities in the city, but they bought some acreage out in the country. Could be few acres, 10 acres, whatever, and they've started a farm. Farms are, for agricultural purposes, but also for retreat purposes, to be able to, members want to be out in the country, perhaps they could have events out there, they could recreation, all sorts of things can happen in a quiet environment, which people like to get away from the cities, and it gives that opportunity for people. So I don't think there's an ideal number. I think you have to start with something that's affordable and is going in the direction. And then once you do, then you begin to see, we need more, or perhaps we have too much. And so I think there again, we need experimentation by many different groups to see what works. What works? Best practices to share responsibilities in a community. Obviously, in a community, there's lots of things to do, and often not enough people to do it, and everybody ends up, having to do something. But you'll see this in a small community. When you have your 20-person community, people naturally, meeting people get together, they meet, and you start to say, hey, somebody's got to do this, somebody's got to, be in charge of taking out the trash, or somebody's got to be in charge of watching for the kids, and, mowing the lawn, or whatever it might be. There's lots of things to do. And so people have a way to in small communities, people tend to divide up the various responsibilities. And some people have the idea that we all need to participate in everything, take responsibility in everything. You could try that, but I don't think it works all that well, because people have different abilities. And to force people into mowing the lawn when they're absolutely unsuited for it, it's like pushing uphill. And I think usually, in time, things tend to filter themselves out, where the idea is we have to share responsibility. Now the question comes in, how do you do that? And I think usually what happens, people will say, well, I feel fairly comfortable doing X, Y, and Z, but I'm not much good at A, B, and C. So people tend to sort themselves out according to what they tend to be good at, or what they enjoy, or what they're capable of, and they tend to avoid those things that they're not capable of it. And so sometimes if nobody wants to do something, well, then the community has to face that fact. And if nobody's going to volunteer for it, maybe you have to hire outside help or whatever it might be. But you sort it out. But I think in the sense that everybody has a responsibility. Now, there might be some people that just don't have time or enough. And you could come down to say, well, they're going to contribute and help hire somebody. If de facto, you might say, it might come to that. I think it's, you might say, nicer if everybody physically participates, but it's not always possible. And so I think the important thing is to be flexible. The job needs to get done. How are you going to get it done in the most harmonious way? And if you can do it all together, hey, great. Now I think most communities would agree that this is something, have periods of, periodic work days where we all get together. Something needs to be done. Springtime cleaning, putting things together in the harvest season or whatever it might be. And you encourage everybody to come together to participate and in some fashion. And you can't necessarily require it always, but if the energy and the spirit is high, people will want to participate in that. And you might say it's a show of dedication. So sometimes you have work days once a month, or you could have them even more often, depending upon, again, the situation and what the capabilities are. So I think you'll find there's no one solution for this, but I think keeping the energy up, keeping the spirit up of cooperative effort and ways to share, selfless service, whatever it might be. Try that. Best practices to deal with situations when things don't go as expected. Well, that's just about all the time. In my experience, if it's not one thing, it's another. They never seem to go as expected, but that's, of course, isn't that life? And so, what do you do when you improvise and they don't go as expected? And I actually think that where does the fun come from when you have challenges? You have to have challenges in life, and the community will face its challenges too. And when they don't, I think that's the test. Just as an individually, we face challenges. So what do? We do the best we can. Well, same thing with the community. And I think in times of difficulties, in every community, sooner or later, because it's life, will go through times of difficulties. It may be financial, might be interpersonal difficulties within the community, existential type things, circumstances around the community changes, forcing some sort of adaptation. And I think these times tend to be, because they're challenges, people have to rise up to meet that challenge. The spirit has to rise up to meet it. Yes, we're going to meet it. You can't avoid it, you might say. And I think these are something that all communities will face sooner or later. I know Ananda has gone through over its 50 plus years of existence, gone through many, I wouldn't say crisis points but very challenging points when things have happened. Sometimes they're external, like we've had that forest fire we had in our early years, or when we had government opposition that was very, very serious to us in the early years. We had to face that. We had to face that fire. What the economics of it, how are you going to pay for all of these things? Those things came up. Then there's internal disputes. People change and situations change. Those begin to create dissension within the community, and that has to work itself out. And Ananda certainly has not been a paradise of harmony forever. Individuals have found harmony even in the worst of situations, but yet the world itself and social situations, well, they create challenges. And so the best practices, I think, where there's Dharma, there's victory, has been one of Ananda's sayings, Yato Dharma Tato Jaya, Sanskrit. And keeping in mind one's ideals. There's always a demand to some degree to compromise one's ideals. To what degree does one do that? We've tried not to, but yet that is balanced by we have to be practical with our ideals, but not lose those ideals. And so I think in times of crisis, times of difficulty, they bring to the fore our spirituality. And if your community is based on spiritual principles, people can transcend the worldly pressures. And I think that's one of the values, you might say, of a spiritual community, as opposed to, you might say, a secular community based upon economics or something like that. You kind of can get beyond your likes and dislikes and sacrifice for the whole, which is a life demand sacrifice from time to time because it makes us grow. So anyway, I'll just leave it at that. There is somebody asked about, okay, and one more thought about that is community is like, I was thinking about, it's like a marriage in some way. When you get married, there's going to be rough times as well as good times. You're going to face challenges, but you're committed to a principle. And when things get rough, you step back the day to day and you say, why did we enter into this family community of, let's say, in a marriage? Because there are certain principles and you go back to those. And I think most marriages find those moments when they have to introspect and say, okay, we're committed to this principle. And without commitment, well, can a marriage last? You have to be very committed. And of course, a willingness to sacrifice for that commitment. And the question somebody asked, why do communities fail? Well, of course, we had a class on that. I think it was the second one or so, maybe, or the third one. Things that cause communities to fail. But I think why they would fail is they lose their commitment to those ideals, like I just mentioned. We started for certain reasons, higher purpose, and we hold those ideals, and eventually, well, life intervenes, and those ideals are not quite so important for us anymore. They don't motivate us, and this is why I think religious communities have, in this age at least, right now, going forward, why they're very important and likely to be more successful is because it's not the particular religion, it's the ideals that are expressed in one religion or another. In other words, there's something transcendental that is beyond my likes and dislikes. And so to the degree that we can maintain that, we find that it helps us transcend those difficulties. And then we keep those ideals alive, because with those ideals comes a magnetism, because it focuses groups of people toward a common goal. So you could say, if it's not religious, you have to have that magnetism of a vision toward a common goal. We are here intentionally. And so I keep bringing up that word intention. This is an intentional community. We're here for a purpose. We're trying to do something that's transcendent beyond one's individual likes and dislikes. And so community is an ideal. And so an intentional community is to try to create that. And as long as we have that ideal, well, we're going to work for it. And eventually in time, it can happen that forces, sometimes the forces, they may fail because they're beyond our control. That can happen. We wanted to have a community, but it wasn't possible. But that's, I don't think, the sort of failure that we're speaking about here. It's something more internally. And if you see most communities, it's not going to last forever. Sooner or later, something is going to cause that community to dissolve, whether it's external forces or internal loss of that initial vision and magnetism. And it's like that initial energy force slowly dissolves, and eventually people go here and there elsewhere. It's somewhat a melancholy thought, but That's life. And ideally, it graduates to something even higher. Everybody has achieved, the community has achieved its purpose, you might say. And we all ascend to heaven, or what all might it be. But I think we evolve to the point where the world itself becomes our community. And maybe that is an idealistic vision for the future, but who knows? So somebody asked a practical question. Is anybody thinking of starting a community in Utah? Duh. I don't know. Maybe. If anybody is from Utah out there and wants to start a community, perhaps we can hook you up. Other things that can bring communities together. We talked a little bit about that, and this one gives an example of diet, health, vegetarianism. These things are possible. And actually, Swami Kriyananda said that he would expect communities to form around such interests sooner or later. Whether they're long-lasting or not, we'll see. They could see. But he said, why not? And he actually encouraged it. Why not? If people have strong interest in something, and communities don't need to, they can be a loose-knit community of people working toward certain individual goals. He gave examples of health. He gave examples of education. He gave examples of environmentalism, music, the arts. It's been historically, there's the art community, you could say, or the environmental community. And again, going back to that original definition which I gave, which was people grouped around a certain ideal. They can form it, and it doesn't necessarily have to always be residential, but people who gather around something. I think this too is community, and it's not to be dismissed. I think it's from that they start in a community, let's say community of vegetarians, and they say, hey, we have other interests as well, and maybe they actually do something physically and residential as well. So it's possible. This is a bigger one. I touched on it already, but the question is, how important is a leader's role in a spiritual community? And again, I just come back to it, and again, it's a leader versus leadership. Oftentimes you need a leader to get started, but that leader has to transmit that qualities to a broader base, or else when that one is no longer with us, how do you continue? So consequently, and of course you have different communities can have different mechanisms by which that role can be passed on. And the question here very practically, how many Ananda Brotherhood communities, residential communities have been established in Ananda worldwide after Swami has left his body? I don't think we've started any that I can think of after. That was 2013. But interestingly, this question, and then perhaps it's even one of the reasons that motivated me to do this class, this question is in the air. How are we going to start? We want to start. I mean, I particularly have a history of the last 15 years in India. And Swami was very keen on wanting to start a community in India. But you can't just go out and start a community without having an environment, an understanding of basic principles. And so that's what we've been working on in India. We've started centers, we've started meditation groups. We're starting right now. We've got a monastery, which is a community in its own right, coming up a little bit outside Chandigarh, North India. But we've been talking about how can we eventually evolve to a practical live-in community. We tried to start one outside of Pune, but it just didn't work for many different reasons. But I think it was because to some degree, there needs to be a basic understanding, a cultural understanding, societal understanding, or at least amongst a group of people of what it means to be a community. And I think you have to have a core group of enough younger people. I don't say young people, but younger than my age, at least, because it takes a great deal of energy. And it takes that to be able to start something. So we haven't yet started, but the question is in the air of how are we going to do that? And the same dynamic is taking place in Europe. as well. And we've tried to start a little here, a little there, and it quite hasn't coalesced yet. But there is serious movement right now in Europe to do that. And so I expect something will happen. And we had a burst of forming our urban communities in America in the 1980s mostly. And we've started centers in other locations, but to actually call those initiatives communities might be a little stretch. But we do have community in the sense of the ideal, in the sense we have this online community, which which we're participating in right now, both in India and in America. And we have the, you could say, it's not concrete, but the idea of groups getting together in different formats around the idea of community, this more or less nebulous community of artists, community of gardeners, community of people interested in one thing or another, those tend to be forming. But to actually buy property and engage in that, this is something that's in the air. So I can't answer that in the sense that we've been able to find the formula to start these things, but we are trying. And we'll see. I would expect within this decade we're in right now, the 2020s, I would suspect something will arise in this decade. And so now, the questions that have come in online, do we have one or two? The question, I'll repeat, how to start a spiritual community in which its individual members have different spiritual paths. Actually, there is, without naming anybody, there is such an effort going on right now with friends of Ananda community trying to do that. And I think it's a wonderful experiment, and we'll see what happens. I don't want to point them out specifically because who knows what's going to happen, and it hasn't actually started yet, but it's in the works. How to do it? This is a big question, and I'm very curious. I'm very curious to know the answer. What is and I think it should certainly be possible. And as in a sense, Ananda communities have always been tolerant of people. We say that we're formulated around the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda, but the teachings of Paramhansa in a broad sense, you could say. And all of our communities have always had people of different persuasions within them, and we're very tolerant of that. So I think the ideal here is speaking from an Ananda point of view, I certainly think it's possible to have such a thing, but usually the leadership and the driving force needs to have some focus. And I think it comes back to a clarification of what those ideals are, and to the degree that they can be embodied and actualized and agreed upon. I think that's the key. So I for example, there was a group of people speaking, wouldn't it be possible to have a community of Methodists or a community of Presbyterians or a community, but then it was broadened out from there. Well, of Christians, whatever their denomination is, of course it would be possible to have such a thing if everybody could agree, you see, on basic principles. I suspect if to the more narrow one's definition of what those spiritual principles are, of course, the more narrow it is of the community's focus would be. Maybe that could be good in some ways, in the sense it's coherent. And the broader it is, perhaps, does that lose magnetism, or does it, by the fact that it's more inclusive, perhaps it gains magnetism? This is a wonderful experiment. I hope people will actually take up, because I think it is going to be the challenge of this century, you could say this 21st century, is communities are developing, coming together, and I think there are common values. Are they enough to hold people together? They should be, but it depends on the consciousness of the individuals. If individuals of our high consciousness, why should it not be? I know there are small groups of people that are actualizing this in small groups. And so I would say the answer is yes, but we need more, and we need a more definition to that. So if you know of those, please send some information to me, because I'm interested in the topic, and I'd like to promote that. Now, I would actually say I'm sounding a little hesitant on it, but I should remind myself that there has been a very large community movement in America ever since Ananda began. It probably precedes Ananda. So yes, the fact is there are many communities in America already, and they certainly are not all religious. So yes, I'd say the answer definitely is yes. The dynamics of how to create them, it's a little bit amorphous, but there is a whole communities movement which you could get in touch with. There used to be, and I don't know if it's still existent, the Communities magazine, and the founder of that magazine was a friend of mine, and he would travel throughout America from one community to the next. He never had a permanent place to stay. He always was staying with somebody in some community. He called himself the peripatetic communitarian. And he affirmed that, and just like I do, that yes, communities are a viable alternative and they will succeed. And so you'd have to delve in a little bit more into the nuts and bolts of that, which is beyond my capacity. Maybe that magazine still is in publication. Check it out. Maybe on Google you can find it. So any further questions? What's being asked here is that can we starting a legal structure by which these ideas can be promulgated? Well, of course, in India, that is exactly what Ananda is. It is an NGO, but I will, and probably if you're going. This is one of the difficulties, and that is different countries have different rules by which one can organize. And if you're going to be receiving donations, if you're interfacing with government rules and regulations, you have to abide by those. And forming an NGO is what we've done in India to be able to do that. But of course, in Italy, it may be different. In America, it's a nonprofit organization. You can form that as well. So yes, you have to probably, just for practicality's sake, at some point one does need to legally organize in order to be able to conduct business as a established community. And I think there may be better ways. I've always been somewhat adverse to such legal organization, but it does have a value in the sense that it does bring coherence, and it forces one to focus one's attention by having to put it in legal form. It does have that value. But I think it's like keeping it to the minimum. Is usually best because you can keep your flexibility. And government sometimes has a difficult time understanding spiritual principles and spiritual ways of organizing. But I think it's evolving. And I think if we'd had more communities creating more examples, I think it would ultimately actually influence and make way and perhaps make a pathway in government for that. And I know actually Ananda's creating this community in the area where we live, and this is in Nevada County in California. When we came here, there was no land use policies that made way for such a thing as a community. And we blazed a trail to allow that to happen. We had to create, working with the local planning government, and we actually created something and helped influence county government in a planning sense for the future. So I think more of that is needed. You'll find some areas in America, I'm using that, are very, very restrictive to make it almost impossible to own land together and form a community. And then you find other places that are very liberal. So it comes down to local government and not on macro. Your individual body, and if you're going to interface with the government in some legal fashion, you have to form that relationship. And I would say it's very important to do that. There's a saying in the planning literature or the planning tradition that neighbors enforce the law. And wherever you live, you're going to have neighbors. And it's extremely important you develop positive relationships with your neighborhood around yourself, because sometimes communities can be seen as threatening. Oh, who are these strange people coming and doing something different? And if you don't have good relations, it can be difficult and obstacles can come. Whereas, so a lot of energy from Ananda's side in its community has gone out to public relations, being friends, which is a good spiritual principle anyway. And so you have to have that. But again, if you're going to actually, on a practical level, start a community, you need to know the rules and regulations of wherever it is that you're going to buy property, to know what obstacles you're facing. Should you want to own property in common, do building in common, do anything in a common fashion, there's zoning issues. All of these come up, and they're the practical obstacles, but they can be overcome. In some places more easy than in others. Sometimes the rules need to be changed, and that is a little bit more difficult. But investigate that before you buy property. If you are going to buy property, let's say 20 acres, wanting to start something or want to do a community project all in common, check your zoning laws and check with the local government to make sure that, or at least you know what the obstacles are going to be. So you may have to modify your idealism to the practical situation. So, another question, Bharat?
Yes, there is one more question. It is, how can we do jobs and earn money for regular living and household duties while still living in community?
You have to balance your life. We have duties. You know, we have household duties, we have family duties, we have individual duties. But of course, if we want to live in community, we're willing to take on other responsibilities as well. In other words, to participate, but participation in a community has to be considered on many different levels. And we have to remember that each of us go through various stages in life. A child is one thing, a young adult is another, a married couple has other duties. And so consequently, a community is broad-based. And this is, you could say, if everybody's expected to do the same thing and take up the same burdens, it doesn't allow for a broad range of people to be in that community. So if you're going to have a community that has children, young adults, families, elder people, the people with lots of resources, other people with less resources, there has to be, in different talents, there has to be enough leeway to allow for those variety of situations. And you accept the fact that if a community has people with lots of children, well, obviously, parents have certain duties. They have to be accommodated. And the same thing, if you have elders who can't work so much, they can't do outward things so much. They have different needs. So you have to find accommodation for that. I think this is one advantage of having a community that's a little bit larger and broader, because there's more spectrum, you could say, for the variety of people that you have. So but everybody can't be expected, I don't think, to do the same thing and to equally, we're all going to do this, we're all going to do that, we're all going to do the other thing. It might be, perhaps in a religious monastery, there might be everybody does everything the same, but I don't think that probably is even the case. There has to be a certain, according to one's ability, and according to one's ability to give, and according to one's ability to perform, and we have needs according to our needs. And so there has to be variety. I don't know. I don't think it could survive otherwise. I want to thank everybody for participating in this 5-week journey on this discussion of communities. Please do communicate. You can send email directly to me, Jaya, Jaya, at anandaindia.org. I'd like your comments and I'd like your questions if you have questions, and I will respond sooner or later, depending upon how many questions come in. And let's keep this idea in motion. If it has any, because this is an ideal. The practical application of this ideal is going to take time, but it's in the ether for this age. And the principle of community, of coming together, is Sri Yukteswar, where I started with, when people aspire to that and come to that realization that the important thing is finding truth, discovering God, and seeking that, and that becomes the motivating factor in one's life, or higher values, if you want to say it that way, they naturally are going to be attracted, and their magnetism will draw them into the company of other people with similar ideals. And as we gather, that is the beginning of community. As we gather together in that way, similar ideals, and actuating that, associating with that satsang community, magnetism is built. And that magnetism is a powerful force, will draw support and will draw energy to these efforts. And the masters have predicted, and in this age that's going to extend before us for a period of time, some 1,000 years, 2,000 years, that this will be one of the forces, that a dynamic that is being expressed as consciousness, awareness increases in this age. It will manifest itself because we'll begin, as Paramhansa Yogananda said in the autobiography, he said that Babaji, Mahavatar Babaji, predicted that Kriya Yoga will be an instrument in helping individuals realize their kinship, with their brothers and sisters, through their own inner realization of God within themselves, and then seeing that same God that resides within us resides in everybody. And that force alone will begin to bring people together to overcome the divisions that are now so prevalent in society, divisions of race, caste, country, nationalism. Those will begin to dissolve and will come together in a more harmonious world brotherhood community. God bless all of you, and I hope to see you again in whatever our next topic of class series is focused upon. God bless.